Hello, my name is Mungo Dodd, a student on the Critical Theory MA programme at Goldsmiths, University of London, and today I will be discussing J.G. Ballard's 1969 novel, The Atrocity Exhibition. My approach will be a little unconventional. Rather than limiting myself to the confines of the novel, I wish instead to use this experimental collection of interconnected stories as a kind of point of departure, or zero from which to count upwards, in order to trace the technical transformation of sexual fantasy since the novel's initial publication. Thus, whilst I will begin with an analysis of the novel itself, I hope ultimately to use the novel as a way of understanding how the massive proliferation of online pornography since the 1990s has transformed the imaginative components of sexuality, desire, and sexual fantasy. The Atrocity Exhibition is something of an oddity in Ballard's catalogue. Published in the 6-year interval between his early science fictional work and his later style that would carry him until his death in 2009, as characterised by novels like Crash and High Rise. The Atrocity Exhibition is often characterised as a transitional work, a working through of greater things to come. However, I think this view does a disservice to the novel's radical idiosyncrasies. Most obviously, it is by far the most experimental of Ballard's novels, influenced in part by Burroughs and surrealist use of cut-up, but perhaps more majorly by Ballard's after-hours experiments with the photocopier at his then workplace, which was then a novelty. The novel's form, with its disjointed headlines and lists, remains utterly its own. More importantly, beyond his autobiographical work, it is Ballard's only backwards-facing novel. Elsewhere, he is almost always future-oriented, concerned with prophecies of near futures, diagnosing latent psychological impulses in the popular imagination that might soon or one day violently blossom. In contrast, Atrocity Exhibition was compiled at the end of a decade that it turns around to look back upon. The task of the novel was to depict the unique collision of Hollywood and Hiroshima, the Kennedy assassination and Liz Taylor, as brought about for the first time ever through the technologies of press, film and television. Looking back on the novel, Ballard reasons that a unique collision of private and public fantasy took place in the 60s that will never be repeated again. Yet, it is precisely this historical specificity that makes the novel so prescient for understanding how much, or how little, our relationship with media and technology has changed over the last 50 years. The novel's disjointed and constantly restarting plot follows a name-changing protagonist, varyingly called Travis, Traven, Travers and Talbot, as he performs strange reenactments of the Kennedy assassination, ruthlessly pursues sexual union with the screen actress Elizabeth Taylor, and flees from burning helicopters. The setting is the reservoirs of Staines and Shepperton, which have strangely collided with images of the American mass media, the billboards multiplied around them, walling the streets with giant replicas of napalm bombings of Vietnam, the serial deaths of Liz Taylor and Marilyn Monroe terraced in the landscapes of Dien Bien Phu and the Mekong Delta. Filled with barbed wire perimeter fencing and helicopters that explode at random, the London suburbs are unrecognisable. Elsewhere, Travis spends an entire week stood atop a maze that appears to have been styled to resemble the curve and cleavage of Elizabeth Taylor. Perhaps most surreal of all are the disturbing serial deaths of Karen Novotny. In one scene, her armless body hangs face down from a car's rear window, the burning fuel tracing a delicate lacework upon her skin. Each chapter, the protagonist Travers murders his lover in increasingly elaborate ways, yet the next chapter she is alive and well without a word said. Thematically, the novel is concerned with the technological transformations of the erotic imaginary that took place in the 1960s. That is, transformations of the shared cultural and psychological space in which our imaginations collectively shape and are shaped by the sex images and sex narratives that are distributed across society, from which we learn our sexualities, through which sexuality itself is constituted and transformed. Specifically, the novel depicts the erotic imaginary of the 60s as uniquely communalised and palimpsestic. The same material is repeated and mutated over and over. The sexualities of Monroe and Taylor and Jackie Kennedy are permanently present, penetrating and reconstituting every thought into their image. In one passage, the hollow basins of cracked mud are inversions of the eroded breasts of Marilyn Monroe. At the weapons range, Travis sees half-familiar contours, the model of a face, a posture, a neural interval, and then impulsively murmurs the words, Elizabeth Taylor. Taylor resides at the very centre of an erotic virtuality that one cannot help but participate in. What Talbot is searching for is the primary act of intercourse, the first apposition of the dimensions of time and space. In the multiplied body of the film actress, he finds what seems to be a neutral ground. She's the sun that gives life to all sexualities that revolve around her, the neutral zero that sexuality is to be measured from. And yes, the virtual erotic space that Ballard describes has not gone away. We still, as in the 60s, all take part in sex whether we want to or not. Through the internet, we are rather literally plugged into a shared erotic matrix through which we access pornography, find and interact with virtual or real sexual partners. However, a 21st century atrocity exhibition would necessarily depict a far more chaotic, decentralised sexual matrix than that found in the original. Ballard's world is chaotic, yes, but every vector ultimately leads back to the neutral ground of Elizabeth Taylor. In the erotic imaginary of today, the iconography is far more disparate, far less communal, far more personal. The untouchable, endlessly repeated sexual deities of the 60s gone, replaced by a seemingly endless pool of pornographic actors and actresses. I propose that this shift from celebrity culture to internet pornography is part of a more general shift from an obsessional palimpsestic culture, one that obsesses and mutates the same material over and over again, to a culture of hyper-ephemerality, in which mediatic phenomena are drastically more replaceable and shorter-lived in the cultural imaginary than ever before. Online porn appears part of this movement from obsession to disposability. The cultural imaginary of the 60s was uniquely dominated by only a handful of figures and events. Hiroshima, Liz Taylor, the JFK assassination, Vietnam. The atrocity exhibition is littered with assembly kits of these images. Images are repeated and reoriented so much that they can be recalled at will, as solid in the psyche as any personal memory. Today, the cultural imaginary has become not only larger but more localised and personal, less communal even as the world becomes ever more interconnected. Today, through the massive proliferation of web pages, streaming services and TV channels, all individuals consume vastly heterogeneous content from one another. As noted, Ballard saw the 60s as unique and unrepeatable in its collision of private and public. With the massive expansion in digital media, it is as if psychology has gone private again, while our psyches retain traces of the collage construction of early postmodernism. Now each collage is increasingly unique, each subject consuming an arrangement of information as unique as one thumbprint. This movement is typified in the production and distribution of sex images, moving from the explicitly public domain of popular culture to the more private, or at least more secretive, less spoken of domain of internet pornography. This is no unsubstantiated claim. In an extensive survey from as far back as 2008, 87% of young men and 31% of young women reported using internet pornography, a large proportion of those engaging in weekly use. Likewise, research finds increasing numbers of adolescent males and females learn their sexual and gender preferences through online pornography. Increasingly, new generations are directly constructing their sexualities and even learning the mechanics of sex through online pornography. We are then witnessing a rather literal embodiment of Baudrillard's famous claim that the map now precedes the territory. In Atrocity Exhibition, Travis routinely attempts to transcribe private sexual acts with his lover, Karen Novotny, onto the public body of Elizabeth Taylor, a kind of virtual sexual union. Yet in the 21st century, we're increasingly arriving at a society in which young men and women are more likely to transcribe the imagined sex that they have already had with pornographic actors and actresses onto the body of their first sexual partners. We're then witnessing a transition from sexualized celebrity to sex on screen, and a subsequent decline of the active, rearranging form of sexual fantasy that we see in Atrocity Exhibition, in which the subject is compelled to rearrange and bring the image closer. And with the rise of internet pornography, most of which is by earlier standards a form of hardcore, we move to sexual fantasy as a domain that the subject steps into. This is of course not the end of the previous form of fantasy, nor is this pornographic space anything strictly new. However, We are moving towards the dominance of a different kind of fantasy, in which the viewer is far more passive and the pornographers are far more in control, manipulating what we see, revealing as much of the sexual scenery as possible and in absolute detail. I thus propose we are witnessing the waning of sexual fantasy as a creative act, and a movement towards sexual fantasy as a ready-made or pornotopian domain, not dissimilar architecturally from an unlimited and hyperspeed virtual shopping mall. Fundamentally, we are moving away from sexualized obsession with a small number of celebrities who are always held at a distance, always a little clothed, towards an ephemeral erotic imaginary of pornographic specificity, in which everything is revealed, even magnified, and almost every imaginable sexual act can be found online and put on screen. In 2014, pornography sociologist Martin Barker outlined a peculiar paradox in public discussions of sexual fantasy and pornography. In public complaints about pornography, it is common for people to protest that pornography leaves nothing to the imagination. It is the literal showing of genitals and sexual activity, and that very literalness is the danger. Yet at the same time, it is this very literalness that somehow generates a fear of sexual fantasy. In particular, the danger that people, or young men specifically, might blur or lose the distinction between fantasy and reality. Embedded in this paradox is an implicit distinction between two kinds of sex image. On the one hand, hardcore pornography of the kind increasingly found online, that leaves nothing to the imagination. On the other, unsaid but implied, is a kind of sex image that leaves aspects for the imagination to complete, the kind of eroticized but not quite naked that invites the imagination to bring the image closer. In other words, the kind found throughout the atrocity exhibition. We are then dealing with two distinct forms of sex image, the absolutely and obscenely revealed, and the imaginatively stimulating soft core of popular culture, where not quite enough is shown. Indeed, ballad actresses are always positioned as objects of fantasy, whose real meaning as sex images only comes about when they are reorganised by the viewer's imagination. He writes in a footnote added in the novel's 1990 edition, "Beyond our physical touch, the breasts of these screen actresses incite our imaginations to explore and reshape them. The bodies of these extraordinary women form a kit of spare parts, a set of mental mannequins that resemble Belma's obscene dolls. They tease us, so we begin to dismantle them, removing a section of a smile, a leg stance, and enticing cleavage. The parts are interchangeable, like the operations we imagine performing on these untouchable women. Ingrained in the subject, any subject's imagination, the actresses resemble dolls that the fetishizing subject moves around and reassembles at will, forcing and contorting them into any erotic scenario that he or she imagines. Yet, this imaginative potentiality is distinctly bound up in the distance of the celebrity, not quite naked, not quite tangible, and whilst they are perhaps pornographic, they are not quite pornography. In contrast, the hardcore that largely inhabits the internet, that is, uncensored video footage of penetrative sex and more perverse things, functions very differently. In hardcore, by nature of the fact that everything is on show, the viewer is far more at the behest of the images on screen, less free to imaginatively reconfigure. In his essay, The Ecstasy of Communication, Jean Baudrillard outlines a kind of contemporary obscenity that strikes a similar chord. It is no longer then the traditional obscenity of what is hidden, repressed, forbidden or obscure. It is the obscenity of the visible, of the all too visible, of the more visible than the visible. No longer the obscenity of secret passions lying under the surface, but the obscenity of the absolutely shown. The obscenity of hardcore is of this kind. Everything is visible, every aspect of the mechanics and components of the sexual act made visible in microscopic detail. In her now seminal 1989 study of pornography, feminist film theorist Linda Williams detects something similar in the specific acts of hardcore pornography. Of particular note is her discussion of the pornographically ubiquitous money shot, in which the male performer ejaculates upon the face, breast or genitalia of the female performer. Perhaps nothing new in itself, yet it is only in the realm of the obscene spectacle in which all must be seen to be believed that this action would become so normative. The money shot extending visibility to the next stage of representation of the heterosexual act, to the point of seeing climax. Yes, this new visibility extends only to a knowledge of the hydraulics of male ejaculation, which, though certainly of interest, is a poor substitute for the knowledge of female wonders that the genre still promises. Yet this climax is now rendered in glorious Eastman colour, even on a widescreen with optical or slow motion effects. The hardcore pornographer's impetus is actually to leave as little to the imagination as possible, to extend visibility to the feeling of the climax itself, to provide the maximum visual evidence for everything on screen. Whilst the heterosexual pornographic film is generally structured around the woman's possibly or probably faked orgasm, the money shot, positioned at the end of the film, is concrete visual and biological evidence that might prove to the viewer that what they saw was real. Thus, as hardcore pornography rapidly replaces the sexualized celebrity in the erotic imagination, we can infer a technical shift in how our imaginations interact with the sex image. In Atrocity Exhibition, the screen actresses are, and have to be, acted upon by the imagination. The kit of spare parts must be put to use, as the actresses are captured and forcefully turned into pornography. Yet hardcore, in its absolute explicitness, asks for as little of this interaction as possible. The nature of hardcore is that it leaves nothing to the imagination. It is, in Baudrillard's terms, the quadraphonics of sex. It adds a third and fourth track to the sexual act. Science has already habituated us to this microscopics, this excess of the real, and its microscopic detail, this voyeurism of exactitude, the end of the secret. Outside of the physical contact which must, at least today, still be imagined, there is a sense that hardcore pornography leaves even less to the imagination than the physical act of sex itself. The image surpasses the detail of the original. Details of genitalia that would never be visible in the traditional sexual intercourse can be zoomed in upon and might suddenly take over an entire frame. Due to this hyperspecificity, it becomes difficult to see anything other than what is shown on screen. Likewise, with ever-increasing developments in virtual reality porn, sex AI, and newly popular websites like OnlyFans, through which monthly subscribers pay to gain intimate access into the private lives of both professional and amateur performers, we are seeing that digital pornography is hurtling towards closing the gap between viewer and performer, relinquishing as much of the imaginary bridge as possible. We perhaps see that whilst the world of Atrocity Exhibition appears on the surface deeply fantastical, it is really a novel about the act of fantasizing, the process of imaginatively re-rendering images to bring them closer and see them differently. For Travis, the palimpsestic culture of the 1960s was almost drug-like, compelling him to bring these famous women closer, to reenact the assassination of JFK in a way that makes sense, to use his lover Karen Novotny as a conduit for sexual intercourse with Elizabeth Taylor, though not in a literal sense of that term. In contrast, hardcore pornography short-circuits this imaginative component, the act of fantasizing becoming less fantastical, the act of reorganization becoming increasingly redundant. In an age in which anyone can switch between a limitless supply of both vastly heterogeneous and incredibly specific pornographic films with instantaneous speed, the task of the fantasizer is not to imagine something new, but merely to accept the terms of this strange world of infinite sex, in which everyone is wanting sex all of the time, a space of limitless supply and limitless demand and infinite variety, a pornotopia, if you will. This is a desire that chooses, that ranges an infinite virtual shopping mall, rather than a desire that creates. I'm afraid that due to limitations on time, I can only leave the listener to decide whether this transformation of sexual desire might be considered a component in a more general, more sinister transformation. Thank you very much. It was very nice speaking to you today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference.